Hey, something didn't get said in part one. We talked about the disruption, the anxiety, the way growing up inside a broken social contract leaves marks on a generation that don't wash off easily. And all of that was true. But there's a side of Gen Z psychology that doesn't get enough space in these conversations. Not the wounds, but the weapons. Not what was done to them, but what they built because of it. Because here's what happens when you grow up with no illusions. You get very, very good at seeing clearly. And clear vision, in a world running on comfortable fictions, turns out to be one of the most disruptive things a person can carry into a room. This video is about that. About the specific ways Gen Z's mind works that the generations before them are still trying to catch up to. About why what looks like chaos from the outside is often something much more deliberate on the inside. If you watched part one and wanted more, stay with me. And if this channel is new to you, hit subscribe. We break down the psychology behind the things most people only argue about without ever really understanding. Drop a comment below too. I read every single one. Because the full picture of Gen Z psychology requires two lenses. Part one was about what shaped them. Part two is about what that shaping actually produced. And what it produced is stranger and more interesting than most people give it credit for. Here's what nobody tells you about how Gen Z actually processes the world. They don't trust narratives. Any narratives. Not the ones from the left, not the ones from the right, not the ones from brands, institutions, governments, or well-meaning adults who grew up in a different century and keep offering maps to a territory that no longer exists. Psychologists call this epistemic vigilance, the tendency to evaluate the source and motive behind information before accepting it as true. Most people develop some version of this over a lifetime. Gen Z arrived at it early, and they arrived at it hard. Growing up chronically online does something specific to the way a mind sorts truth from noise. When you've watched the same event get reported 17 different ways before breakfast, you stop looking for the one true account and start looking for the pattern underneath all of them. You get less interested in what people are saying and more interested in why they're saying it, what they're selling, who benefits from you believing this particular version of events. That's not cynicism. That's media literacy at a level previous generations never had to develop because they didn't need it. The information environment didn't demand it. Gen Z's does. The research behind this runs in a direction most people don't expect. A 2023 report from the Reuters Institute found that Gen Z consumes news differently from every generation before them. Not through traditional outlets, but through peer networks, short video, and direct creator content. On the surface, that sounds like a problem. Dig one layer deeper and something else appears. Gen Z cross-references information across multiple sources faster than any previous generation. They're not less informed, they're differently informed, with a built-in suspicion of single-source authority that older generations, raised on the 6 o'clock news, genuinely struggle to understand. There's also research from Stanford's Graduate School of Education showing that while Gen Z struggles to identify sponsored content in traditional formats, they outperform older adults significantly when evaluating the credibility of lateral reading, the practice of opening multiple tabs to check a source against itself. They didn't learn this in school. They learned it from living inside an information war from the age of 8. In plain terms, their BS detector isn't broken. It's calibrated for a different kind of BS than the ones previous generations were trained to spot. Here's where it goes somewhere the public conversation about Gen Z almost never reaches. The thing that makes Gen Z so difficult to manage in traditional structures is the same thing that makes them so effective when those structures actually deserve their trust. They don't give loyalty automatically. They give it selectively, after observation, to people and institutions that demonstrate alignment between what they say and what they actually do. Consistency, follow-through, honesty about limitations. This is the uncomfortable truth about Gen Z in the workplace, in politics, in every institution currently struggling to hold their attention. They're not disengaged. They're waiting to be given a reason to engage that doesn't insult their intelligence. The generations who built those institutions learn to trust by default and withdraw trust only after betrayal. Gen Z learn the opposite. Withdraw trust by default, extend it only after proof. That isn't a personality flaw baked into an entire generation. It's a rational response to growing up watching institution after institution promise one thing and deliver another. You can disagree with the strategy, but you can't call it irrational. And here is the part that explains more about Gen Z than almost anything else. They think in systems. Not in the way that gets taught in business school, not as a framework or a methodology, as a reflex. When something goes wrong in their life or in the world, the first question isn't, who made a bad choice? But, what structure made that choice feel inevitable? They look upstream. They ask what the incentives were, what the pressures were, whose interests were being served by the outcome that appeared. This is partly why they talk about mental health, identity, and social issues in the language of systems, because that's genuinely how they experience them. Not as individual failures, but as individual expressions of collective conditions. Growing up watching inequality widen in real time, watching institutional failures broadcast live, watching the gap between the world as promised and the world as delivered get wider every year. It trains a mind to think structurally, to ask not just what happened, but how it was set up to happen. Older generations sometimes read this as a refusal to take personal responsibility. It isn't. Gen Z takes their own lives very seriously. What they refuse to do is pretend that context doesn't exist, that the water someone swims in has nothing to do with how far they get. So here is what the full psychology of Gen Z is really telling us. They're not a generation defined only by anxiety and disruption, though both are real. They're a generation that took a genuinely difficult set of conditions and developed a genuinely sophisticated set of tools for surviving inside them. Epistemic vigilance, systems thinking, selective trust, comfort with contradiction, radical honesty about things that previous generations spent enormous energy politely avoiding. They're not waiting for someone to fix the world and hand it to them. Most of them stopped believing that was coming a long time ago. What they're doing instead is building, slowly, practically, with a clear-eyed understanding of the obstacles, something that actually fits the century they're living in. You're not looking at a lost generation. You're not looking at a soft one. You're looking at a generation that grew up without a safety net and learned to be their own. And that, whatever you think about their methods, deserves more than the dismissal it usually gets. Tell me, are you part of Gen Z, or do you have someone in your life who is? Does this match what you've seen? Drop it in the comments. If this hit home for you, please subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of depth coming. And if you want to keep going, the next video looks at the psychology of people who grew up feeling like the world was moving too fast for them, and why that feeling was never the weakness it seemed.